My name is Kathryn Dennler. It's hard to introduce myself because I'm not here in my work role, actually. I'm here in my non-work role, but okay. I've been living in Canada for about 12 years. I came to Canada as an international student. I did my PhD here in Canada, studying immigration, looking at experiences of precarious immigration status in Canada. While I was doing my PhD, I got really involved with a refugee group, like a refugee support group in Toronto, and then started to work as part of, not work, but started to volunteer as part of a sanctuary network in Canada, a US-Canada border network, which I'm going to talk about a little bit in my presentation, and most recently starting to work supporting a new virtual legal clinic that helps people with issues at the Canada-US border. Again, something I'm going to talk about in the presentation. I also have a job as a researcher and policy worker on Canada's immigration system, but focusing largely on international students and immigrant selection and settlement. But I have a really long-term interest in, I think, lived experiences of immigration policy.
Welcome.
Thank you. It's really nice to hear from everyone and hear about the work you're doing, the different topics that you're studying. And I think I wasn't really sure where to kind of start the presentation in terms of the kind of knowledge and familiarity in the room. I may have started with like a little bit too much background information, but nonetheless, I want to make sure that we have kind of a shared understanding of what we're talking about before we get going. So I think I'm going to do the first part, the kind of like base knowledge part, a little bit quickly, because I think some of you are going to have that knowledge already. And then I'm going to really like turn the focus to the US-Canada border, changes in the kind of ruling regime at the US-Canada border, and looking at some things that have happened at Roxham Road, which maybe some of you are familiar with, and maybe some of you are not yet, but you will be. So yeah, I just wanted to start by laying a little bit of groundwork, as I just said, so that we have a kind of shared idea of what some of the words mean that we're talking about and where they come from. So I wanted to start by, maybe I should just pause and say, can everyone hear me okay, particularly those online? If you're not hearing me, then if you can type it in the chat, and then Anna can let me know. I wanted to unpack, great, I see a thumbs up, thank you. Unpack this kind of label, refugee, because it means a lot of different things to a lot of different people. It gets used in a lot of different ways. And so I really wanted to start, even before we kind of define refugee, I wanted to kind of start by acknowledging that there's a lot of different ways that it gets used. So one way that it gets used is kind of conversationally. People, talk about refugees in the media. People will self-identify as refugees. And I think in conversational use, we could say, broadly speaking, that it's a person who's forced to flee regardless of their legal status. But refugee also has a very specific legal definition. And so sometimes when people use the word refugee, they are referring specifically to someone who has been designated as a refugee under a definition that is laid out in international documents and then kind of put into domestic law. So in general, people can be designated as a refugee either by the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, or by a state that is a signatory to the UN Refugee Convention and the additional protocol. And so typically, if you are designated by the UNHCR, you might live in a refugee camp, or you might be in a third country via a resettlement program. And if you've been designated by a state, it typically means that you've kind of arranged your own travel to get there, and then you've asked for refugee status, and it's been determined whether or not you meet the definition and get refugee protection. And so one thing that's interesting is that this phrase refugee, I've both heard people claim it, people who don't have the legal category of refugee, but they'll say, you can't send me home, I'm a refugee. But I've also heard people reject the label and say, I've lived in this country for 8 years, I've gotten citizenship, why do you still call me a refugee? I live here just like anybody else. So there's a lot of contestation around like, what is a refugee and what does it mean to claim that status? It is potentially a status that brings you rights. It's also potentially something that makes people feel that it's implied that they're in some way subordinate to other people in the place where they're living. So So there's a lot of kind of contestation about the term refugee. Just to highlight, there's other terms that, that people sometimes use, like convention refugee, refugee claimant, asylum seeker, person in need of protection, protected person, refused refugee claimant. So there's all these different terms with different kind of legal and social implications. I'm not going to define them all now, but it is something we can talk about later. Based on the introductions, I'm guessing that many of you are familiar with the definition of refugee. I've kind of paraphrased it from the UN Convention relating to the status of refugees, but a refugee has to meet kind of these 4 criteria, that they have a well-founded fear of persecution. That persecution has to be on specific grounds, and I've listed the 5 grounds for being considered a refugee here. They have to be outside their country of nationality or habitual residence. So you're not a refugee if you're within the country where you have the fear of persecution. And you are unable or unwilling to use the protection that's available to you in order to, not be persecuted. So in other words, like you can't go to the police, or you can't go to the government, or you can't seek protection in the place where you are. Originally, the definition of a refugee was specifically for people who were displaced as a result of World War II. But in the 1967 additional protocol, the time and geographic specifications were taken away. So those are no longer relevant. But originally, this definition was written with reference to people who were fleeing the events of World War II. One thing that I want to point out about this definition is that it's very, very specific. And so my first kind of thought question for you is, who might think of themselves as a refugee or might claim the label of refugee but be left out of this definition? Who are people who you might think it applies to, but it doesn't?
Guesses?
And if we don't have guesses, I can pose some situations and you can tell me if you think that person is a refugee or not. But I want to make sure you have a chance to guess. So I'm going to give you a couple of seconds.
There's a comment online from Lily. There's no acknowledgement of the structural economic violences that create impoverishment and famine.
Okay, that's an excellent example. So if you are fleeing your country because of poverty, famine, and inability to feed yourself and your family, even though you are fleeing from your home in order to save your life, you may have crossed a border, you may be afraid for your life, you may be unable to get protection and get the food that you need in the place that you are, but you would not be considered a refugee. You would be, if you made a claim for refugee status, you would be likely to be refused, even though you are fleeing for your life.
Tasnia says climate-induced displacement, but internal.
Yeah, and climate-based displacement, both internal and external, because you, again, you're not being displaced for persecution, and it's not related to race, religion, nationality, political opinion, membership in a particular social group. So you're not protected under the convention if you are fleeing the results of global climate change. That's right.
And Maria says, we're trying to escape from internal conflicts without specific prosecution. Hard to prove.
Yeah. I knew you guys could do this. This is amazing. So if there is a war going on in your country and there's sort of like generalized violence, this legal definition doesn't necessarily cover you because normally you have to prove that the persecution, that you are the target of the persecution, and it's because of one of these grounds listed in number 2 on the slide. So, generally the idea that bombs are falling on everyone, that's not persecution, that is war. I think there are certain situations where countries are willing to give something like refugee status or some kind of recognition to people who are fleeing war. Lots of examples of that. But that's usually outside kind of the UN convention, not part of the UN convention. So I would just point out that in Canada, basically this definition of a refugee is written into law. It's written into the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. And the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, which we sometimes call IRPA, has to be conducted in a way that's in accordance with Canada's Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So in that little box on the right are some of the relevant kind of legal documents in the Canadian context. So just to let you know, kind of, I showed you that chart about the different, definitions and the different way the term is used. And now I just want to kind of point out that what I'm going to be talking about today is about contestation, about whether or not someone is a refugee and can get recognized as a refugee by Canada. So we're looking at this contestation around getting access to the legal definition, being designated as such by Canada. And we're talking specifically about people who have made their own plans to come to Canada. They found their own way to get here and then are trying to either cross the border or be recognized as a refugee once in Canada. So, there's about 18 lectures on all of the bits of the slide that are grayed out. Those are not the lectures that I'm giving today. The parts that are not grayed out, that's what we're going to focus on. And so I think, one of my main contentions, or one of the main things that I want to share, is that refugee protection really depends on the ability to travel to a place of safety. If you can't get somewhere safe, then you can't really get that protection. But the reality is that states prefer to select the refugees that come, and they like to limit what you can sometimes call spontaneous arrivals, people who make their own way to the place. And in attempting to limit refugees crossing the border on their own, they jeopardize the safety and the human rights of people who are already fleeing war, violence, and persecution. And so this is this connection between border control and refugee exclusion. So I'm going to talk just a little bit about how those are practiced. There's lots and lots of examples. I'm going to kind of focus on Canadian ones because that's the focus of the lecture, but there's plenty of examples of these kinds of things internationally. Broadly speaking, there's two kinds of tactics that states like Canada will use to keep refugees out. Either interception, which is kind of like catching them or apprehending them through the course of their journey and kind of forcing them back or not letting them in, or deterrence, which is basically making the system so difficult to navigate that it's no longer appealing to even try to come to a place like Canada in order to get refugee protection. So I have another question for you. Have you ever had the experience where you've been asked to show a visa before you get on a plane? Or have you ever been getting off a plane and on your way into the airport, you've been asked to show your passport or your visa?
I can say one time I went to Buenos Aires and I had just started my program in Canada. And I think we didn't need visas to go to Canada, but I obviously had a study permit. And people at the counter were like, oh, like, how come you don't need a visa? Like, I don't believe that you're Mexican and you live in Canada. I'm like, well, here's my study permit. Like, I had a direct flight. I had a US visa. So they were a little confused because it was like so far away. But at the end, I just showed them my study permit and it was fine. So.
Okay. So because Canada is in such a remote location, it's very far from most countries, and it's very far from many countries where conflict is taking place. A visa requirement is one of the main tools that the Canadian government uses to stop refugees from coming here. So by requiring airline staff to check a visa before someone gets on a plane, it makes it difficult for someone who needs refugee protection to fly to Canada. And as an alternative, if you're not able to fly to Canada, people sometimes will make their way, kind of by foot and train and all kinds of other modes of transit to get to Canada, which means that travel prevention is another tactic that the Canadian government uses. there's Canadian officers stationed abroad looking for people who seem like they might be seeking refugee protection. There's also the Canadian government pays, for example, to train officers in Mexico to do the work of making it difficult to travel from Guatemala and across the Guatemala-Mexico border and travel up through Mexico to cross the Mexico-Canada border. So both Canada and the US pay to increase the capacity of the Mexican state to stop people from making their way from southern Mexico to northern Mexico. There's also pushbacks, which is sending someone back when they get to the border so that they can't make a claim for refugee protection, as well as regional agreements, which is like saying, if you come to this country from that country, then we're going to send you back to that country. So an example of a regional agreement would be the Safe Third Country Agreement.
And there's also like measures in place, like towards me, there was a lot of emphasis of if you're traveling and you're not Canadian, make sure that you have a flight back. So even before you get on the flight to go to Canada, so there's a lot of measures to make sure that there is a return and there's not an overstaying. So little, and this is even before you're even anywhere close to Canada. So it's very remote, kind of removed surveillance of entering Canada.
Yeah, so that's a really good point, that these kind of like border control practices don't just happen at the border. They can be thousands and thousands and thousands of kilometers away from the border when questions are asked, about, do you have a return ticket? Do you have a visa? Where are you going? Why are you going there? What kinds of connections do you have? There are many, many, many different tools that are used, and I've really only gone over them very briefly here, but there's a lot of literature about those different tools, and it can happen, including, exactly as you said, very far away from Canada. So that's a really good point.
Lily asks if you can provide a reference about Canada training Mexican border officials, since her thesis is about border externalization in Mexico.
I would have to look, but I certainly could. Not right off the top of my head, unfortunately. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about, competing visions of the border, the Safe Third Country Agreement, and Roxham Road.
Just before, what was the regional agreement example you mentioned? Tasman asking.
Yeah, so the regional agreement that is kind of most relevant to what I'm talking about today is the Safe Third Country Agreement, and the name is on the slide. It's often called the STCA for short. But there are other similar agreements in lots of other places.
So is this also referred to as a transit country before entering Canada?
Yeah, it could be, yeah. It's about, what's the country of transit versus the country. And so increasingly countries like Canada that are remote from places of violence are saying you should be seeking protection in your transit country. You shouldn't be transiting through a country and then deciding where you go. You should be seeking protection in the first country you get to.
Yeah.
And there are reasons that people would or wouldn't want to seek protection in those places. So there's kind of this contention around, who gets to decide where is a safe or good place for me to live? Do I get to decide as the person who has to live there, or is that for the state to decide because they think I shouldn't have traveled through Mexico? So for example, the US is increasingly trying to say that Mexico is a safe country to make a refugee claim. And, the Mexican government, I believe, is increasingly trying to say that Guatemala is a good place to make a refugee claim. And so it's like, people keep getting pushed kind of further.
The same thing is happening with Afghans leaving Afghanistan to Pakistan, and Canada saying you can stay, and they end up staying 40 years. And now there's like deportation happening. So it's like,
yeah. So that's that kind of exact phenomenon is taking place all over the globe.
Yeah, we have the same situation in Europe where people are trying to go to certain countries and they don't want to stay in Romania, even though we have a border with Ukraine, for example. They come from Ukraine, but they don't stop in Romania. They just want to go in other places. And what I think is very strange is that they don't understand that those places where they want to go are full of immigrants, so that in Romania they would have a better chance of people like taking care of them, because we don't have as many. So there are available houses, there are available programs, everybody, we have the infrastructure for them, but they don't want to come and stay.
Yeah, and so the decisions that people make about where they want to go are extremely complicated. Again, that could be its whole own lecture
Yeah,
about,
yeah,
you know, what have I heard about different countries? Maybe I haven't heard of Romania,
Yeah.
but I've heard of Britain.
Yeah.
And everybody wants to go to Britain. And I heard that Britain, you know, the streets are paved with gold,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And so it could be that for some people, Romania maybe has something better to offer, but it, you know, maybe I already know people in, you know,
Yeah.
France or Germany or England or Sweden, you know,
Yeah.
wherever that kind of destination country is. Or maybe I've heard such great things about it. Or maybe I've heard that the Romanian police are mean, or, you know, maybe I've
Yeah.
heard negative things about kind of the refugee determination system.
Yeah.
And some, you know, some of that is based on information that's like based in fact, but there's also a lot of like rumor
Yeah.
and misinformation and what I've heard of versus what I haven't heard of. So that it's like a whole kind of complicated system of deciding, you know, where am I trying to go and
Yeah.
why.
It's interesting how, like, I'm interested to see how Canada prolongs people's transit time within a country in order to just to deter them arriving to Canada. And you're looking at the Canada-US borders.
Yeah, and the specifically the border, so the land border. So
Okay.
not people who are flying from the US to Canada, but rather people who are seeking to cross
Okay.
the land border between the US and Canada, which is very long. I can actually forget how many kilometers it is, but it's literal thousands of kilometers. So what I'm going to talk about a little bit is a change that happened in March 2023. So I'm going to start by talking about what was happening at the US-Canada border before March 2023, and then kind of what happened after. So all of this is based on the Safe Third Country Agreement, which was enacted. It's an agreement between the US and Canada that went into effect in December 2004, and it regulates entry into Canada specifically for the purposes of making a refugee claim. So it's not relevant for, you know, people who want to work in Canada or people who are coming on a visitor visa. It's specifically related to people who want to seek refugee protection. And basically, the way the Safe Third Country Agreement worked prior to March 2023 is that it treated people differently depending on where they tried to cross the border. So if someone crossed at an official port of entry, and I'll explain what that is in a minute, they were treated in one way at an official port of entry, and the rest of the border, they were treated in a different way. So an official port of entry is what you would think of as like a formal border crossing. So there's like the little stand with the booth, and you drive up to the booth and you show your passport, and there's like a little building. That's been designated by the government as an official port of entry. So the rules basically were stricter at an official port of entry. For the most part, people would get turned back to the US unless they met an exception. And I have the exceptions listed below. So basically, if you have a close family member, and there's a list of who counts as a close family member, and then you have to prove that you have a close family member. If you're an unaccompanied child, you're at risk of the death penalty, you have a Canadian visa, and then Mexican nationals or other people who don't need a visa. So if you fit an exception to the Safe Third Country Agreement, then you could go to an official port of entry, ask for refugee protection, and they would let you in and process your refugee claim in accordance with the law. If you crossed at anywhere else, so not an official port of entry, the Safe Third Country Agreement did not apply. So you could enter Canada from the US and apply for refugee protection. And they wouldn't ask you to prove like, oh, I have a family member here, and that's why I'm claiming in Canada versus claiming in the US. So this kind of regime has the consequence of encouraging movement across the border at these informal locations rather than the formal location, because there was less to prove, you know, less documentation requirements. So yeah, there was this like disparity in treatment based on how you tried to enter Canada. And I think one thing that is worth saying is the reality is sometimes people would go to an official port of entry and say, my brother is here. But if they don't have the documentation, or if the documentation isn't good enough, I mean, people do get wrongly turned away. So sometimes even if you met an exception to a safe third country agreement, it was sometimes in a way better to cross in an unofficial manner than a crossing officially, because then you don't have that risk of being turned back. And being turned back also comes with some consequences that we can talk about later, like an exclusion order. And anyway, we'll go into that later. But I think it's worth pointing out that even if you meet an exception, sometimes it was nonetheless effective to not go to an official port of entry, but rather cross somewhere else. And so I've put this up here. This is out of date. It's just something that I made with a group that I was working with to try to explain what was happening at the border. I'm not going to, it's basically the same information as the previous slide, but like more aimed at someone who's on the move, like more kind of a plain language explanation. And I've said that it's out of date because it's not true anymore. We had to take it off the internet. Go ahead.
I wonder if it might be helpful just to complement what you're saying, to say something about the terminology of the safe third country agreement and why it's called that. Because if we think that the whole point of seeking refuge is to find a safe country, right? And so what this agreement is between Canada and the US is they're both looking at each other and saying, well, yeah, we think you're a safe country. And the US is saying, yeah, well, we think you're a safe country. So therefore, we shouldn't be obligated under international law to hear a refugee claim coming from that country because you're safe. Your people, the people who are transiting through your country, don't need to seek refuge in Canada because they can seek it in the US where it is equally safe. So the safe third country agreement is just a mutual recognition that the other is safe, which gives them an excuse to say, sorry, you were already in the US, make your claim there, or vice versa, coming north to south. Oh, you were in Canada? Canada's not safe? No, it is safe. You have to stay there and make your claim there. So it allows them to slow the traffic of refugee claims. But then where everything gets really interesting is this bizarre loophole where it doesn't apply if it's an informal crossing.
Yeah, thank you for spelling that out. It is this kind of idea that you could be safe anywhere, or not anywhere, but you could be safe in either place, versus the reality that the conditions, the likelihood of success can be very different from one country to another. You may have close family ties that might not count as an exception to the safe third country agreement, but nonetheless are really vital to you as a person. You know, there's all kinds of reasons you might think that you're better off in Canada versus the United States. But the contention of the agreement is you're safe in either place. So the state perspective is you're safe in either place. The individual perspective may be different. So I just put up this map so you could see Roxham Road. It's about an hour's drive from Montreal. And it's, oh, sorry, I didn't explain what Roxham Road is. So one of the common places where people would cross was at Roxham Road, and we're going to talk about why in a minute. And if you do a Google search, you'll find lots and lots of newspaper articles about Roxham Road. It was such an established phenomenon that there was actually infrastructure at Roxham Road in order to accept people there. So it wasn't an official port of entry, but it had the infrastructure for people to cross there. And we'll talk a little bit more about that. But
What kind of infrastructure?
We'll get there. Yeah. So why were people crossing at Roxham Road? The reason people were crossing at Roxham Road, it doesn't look very clear on the slide. But one of the reasons people were crossing from the US to Canada at Roxham Road is because there's a road on both the Canadian side and the US side, and they come together. And there's about 5 meters where there's no road, but you can stand on the US side and see the road right there on the Canadian side, or vice versa. So it's kind of this, and the reason the road is like that is that it used to be an official port of entry. So it used to be a continuous road from the US into Canada. It's no longer an official port of entry. And so they just kind of like busted up a few pieces of concrete. But otherwise, it is almost effectively a road from the US right into Canada. So it's a very convenient border
those
crossing.
5 meters are crossable?
Yes, they're totally crossable.
Oh, okay, so it's not a like.
If anything tells you that borders are meaningless.
So this is me. Well, it's not me. I took this photo standing on the US side, looking at the Canadian side.
And so you can just jump.
So yeah, I mean, you can walk.
You could just walk.
Oh.
And there's the infrastructure.
Yeah.
So they put up a building in order to accommodate for the reality that so many people were crossing here. And under the Safe Third Country Agreement, they weren't authorized to send them back to the US. So if you crossed the border and said, I need refugee protection, they were under a duty to process your claim. And so basically, they have these like concrete barriers to make it sort of so that you can't drive across, right? But on the side, not in this picture, but on the left side, there's a little path, and people would just walk across the path, and then they would get taken into the building and they would check your documents and write down your name and kind of commence with the like processing of the claim. So that's the kind of infrastructure that was in place.
When was this photo taken?
This photo was taken maybe summer of 2022. So relatively recently. Oops. Trying to remember. And I wanted to point out another reason why people were crossing at Roxham Road. There's actually a much longer history. I can't get into the whole history of, people have been crossing there for a long time, but it became especially famous in 2017 when Justin Trudeau, in response to some not very generous things that were being said and done by the former President Trump in the United States, and in order to highlight the difference between Trudeau and Trump, Prime Minister Trudeau posted this tweet saying, to those fleeing persecution, terror, and war, Canadians will welcome you regardless of your faith. Specifically, Trump had been saying and doing some Islamophobic things. Diversity is our strength. Hashtag welcome to Canada. So, there had been a lot of news about Roxham Road. Justin Trudeau posted this tweet, and it just, there's so many newspaper articles about Roxham Road. So it was a well-known place that people were able to relatively safely cross from the US to Canada and make their refugee claim. So I've shown you the picture already. Okay, I'm gonna just pause the picture. So I was there when the infrastructure was there, and basically there were a couple of RCMP officers who were in that building, and while I was there, some people came up in a taxi. They got out of the taxi, they got their suitcases out of the taxi. There's a whole infrastructure, not just the formal infrastructure here, but there was kind of a whole social infrastructure about how do you get to Roxham Road? And frequently people took taxis. And so in the local town, they made arrangements with local taxi drivers there had been some incidents where taxi drivers were overcharging people for what was a relatively short drive from basically the bus station to Roxham Road. And so they made arrangements in the local town that specific taxi drivers would mainly be the ones to travel this route and to charge a reasonable amount of money and not to, bilk people of their hard-earned money. So, a taxi pulls up, people get out of the taxi, they get out their kind of luggage, they walk across, and the RCMP person came out and said, stop, crossing this border is against the law, you could be subject to arrest. And then if the person continues and walks across, then they bring them inside, check their passport, and kind of proceed with basically lodging the claim and kind of all the like administrative things that need to do to make a refugee claim. So they would tell you not to cross the border, but according to the legal instruments, once you've reached Canadian soil, you have the right to claim refugee status. The Safe Third Country Agreement doesn't apply, so they can't push you back and send you back to the US, and so you're able to make a refugee claim.
So this is a stupid question, but once they make the claim, where do they stay? Like while they're waiting for that claim?
So that is very much evolving. So initially what would happen is like a little bit of the processing, just like some very basic things were done in this building. And then the RCMP had these like buses or minivans, and they put a bunch of people on a bus or a minivan, and they would take them to Lacole. Let me see if Lacole's on the map. Lacole is up in the upper right side of the map. It's probably like a 15-minute drive or a 20-minute drive from Roxham Road to Lacole.
So and they did enter Canada.
Yeah, so they would enter Canada. They'd be brought to Lacole to do more of the paperwork. I think who has an office in Lacole? Maybe CBSA has the office in Lacole. I'm not exactly sure, but there was an authority.
CBSA does.
CBSA. Thank you, Michelle. I have to be careful what I say about CBSA because Michelle's going to know if I'm wrong. So CBSA has an office in Lacole, and so they would get taken to that office in Lacole, and that you have to show your documents. You have to like undergo an eligibility screening to make sure you're eligible to claim refugee status, and kind of like all of those. So those initial steps were done in Lacole. As the numbers of people were increasing, there's been more pressure on the Canadian government to provide housing infrastructure. There's a lot of housing infrastructure in Montreal. There's a lot of housing infrastructure in Toronto, but there's not enough to accommodate. There's been like larger numbers basically as conflict is on the rise. And so the infrastructure hasn't been enough. And so now there's more and more measures to try to encourage the federal government to do more funding of
I would say even in Toronto now, it's a huge issue.
It's a huge issue. Yeah.
Because of the influx of especially African refugees.
Yeah. There were like in 2017 when Trudeau sent the tweet, there were, I guess, like 4 to 5 specialized organizations that were providing housing to newly arrived refugee claimants. And if there's 100, that kind of works. But if there's 1,000, like 4 to 5 houses doesn't really
doesn't cut it.
Doesn't do the job anymore. And so increasingly people, when the numbers went up very quickly early in the Trump years, people were I think it started in the summer, and people were put into dormitories. And then when the school year started, they had to get moved to hotels. There are still people in hotels. They're now diversifying the cities where those hotel contracts are. And so now people are kind of being bussed around. There's a lot of work to be done on that issue.
And we're talking about tens of thousands of people. 30 minutes, I think.
So here's where I was going to make the point that basically refugee rights groups and certain lawyers, object to the idea of the Safe Third Country Agreement because they argue that the US is not safe for all refugees. There's a lot to unpack there, but that's kind of the general contention, is that the US it may be safe for some refugees, but it's not safe for all refugees. So in like early March of 2023, me, along with some of my collaborators, were working on an op-ed that we wanted to publish, basically celebrating Roxham Road. And I'm going to read a short paragraph of what we had written in this op-ed that never ended up getting published. Canada's border management policy should be rooted in a sense of common humanity. The position of the authors is that people should be allowed to make refugee claims at any official port of entry with dignity. However, as long as the Safe Third Country Agreement persists, Roxham Road should be a source of pride, not fear. It sets us apart from other countries around the world. We must live up to our image of ourselves as a nation of compassionate and visionary leaders in refugee protection. So basically, there had been this increased politicization about people crossing at Roxham Road. There was outcry. There's too many refugees coming. The border is out of control. We don't have enough housing. We don't know where to put people. It's too much work. And so the idea of writing the op-ed was basically to celebrate and say, in a world of closed borders and people drowning in the Mediterranean and people dying in the Arizona desert and people trapped in refugee camps for 40, 60, 80 years, multiple generations in the case of Somalia, like what a beautiful thing Roxham Road is, that people are able to take a taxi to this road, to cross a street, to get taken on a bus, to have their claim processed. Like safe passage is actually very much within the spirit of the Refugee Convention, was kind of what we were saying. So just as we were getting ready to celebrate Roxham Road for what we thought the kind of visionary thing that it was, something completely different happened, and we never even submitted the op-ed because everything suddenly changed, causing me and another group of collaborators to hold a funeral mourning the death of refugee rights in Canada. This is in front of Minister Marco Mendicino's office, who was at the time the Minister of Public Safety, and who was involved in this change in policy in March 2023. So in March 2023, the Canadian government and the US government signed an additional protocol to the Safe Third Country Agreement to say that the rules of the Safe Third Country Agreement now apply across the entire land border. So regardless of official port of entry or another point on the border, the same rules apply. And it gives Canada permission to do those pushbacks to send people back to the United States. And not only does it apply across the entire land border, but the Safe Third Country Agreement continues to apply after crossing for 14 days. I hope the wording is clear. So if you are apprehended less than 14 days after your entry into Canada, you can still be pushed back into the United
So you're
States.
effectively crossing for 14 days, basically. You're just waiting. So even if you do come, you're just kind of in a waiting.
So that is exactly the condition that was created by the additional protocol, is that if you cross, you need to remain undetected for more than 14 days in order to be able to make a claim, unless you meet an exemption to the Safe Third Country Agreement. In exchange for this, Prime Minister Trudeau claimed that Canada would admit 15,000 migrants on a humanitarian basis as a trade-off for effectively closing the border for people who need refugee protection in Canada and don't feel that they can get it in the United States. I think one of the things that was really difficult for myself and other advocates to kind of cope with was the fact that this was announced on March 24th, 2023 at about 4 p.m. and it went into effect at midnight. So people who were, organizations that are providing assistance, people who are on the move had 8 hours to either cross the border or lose the right to do so permanently. And I think it's stunning if you imagine like your right to drive in a car or like any right that you have or something that you do in your life, to be told that in 8 hours, this right is going to disappear completely. And the impact was extremely difficult. The reports from the border that night were very dramatic. There were people who had, for example, flown to northern New York or were on the bus when it happened. They were in a rush. People were in a frantic state to try to get into a taxi and to get to the border in order to cross. A few minutes before midnight, there were people literally running down the road. They were abandoning luggage so that they could run faster. There were reporters there watching. A couple of people ended up crossing the border a couple of minutes after midnight, and the RCMP let them in, and the reporters cheered. But a day or two later, those same individuals were found in New York State by other advocates who were working and providing humanitarian aid in the area. So there was this idea that reporters watching thought that those last few people had been let in. But in fact, they were let in and then they were processed under this new Safe Third Country Agreement, and then they were sent back. And so that's the new state of affairs. Roxham Road is no longer a place of safe passage or a way to get into Canada to claim refugee status. I'm going to just maybe do this slide and then I'm going to just kind of open it up for discussion. So these are some of the various ways that groups that I know of and or am a part of are engaging in resistance or advocacy against the Safe Third Country Agreement. There's a longstanding legal challenge of the Safe Third Country Agreement. It started, I think, in 2007, and it's still, parts of it are still ongoing, trying to claim that the Safe Third Country Agreement violates the Canadian Charter and needs to be struck down. So we'll see what happens. There's a number of groups both in Quebec and New York State who are providing humanitarian aid to people on the move. The nature of the humanitarian aid has changed since the closure of Roxham Road, but those efforts, they've changed shape, but they are ongoing. It's included a lot of practical help, like helping people pay for the taxi if they need help paying for the taxi, helping people go to other places in the US if they're unable to cross. Providing people, sometimes people were trying to cross and they didn't have coats and mittens. So sometimes somebody would be at Roxham Road giving out coats and mittens and things like that, being a friendly face before you cross the border. It's not that fun to have the RCMP yell at you, even though they did ultimately let you in. we created a border network so that organizations in the US and Canada can communicate about conditions at the border. The conditions really vary at different places in the border, and port of entry to port of entry, CBSA and RCMP practices vary along the border. So it helps the people in the US because they tend to be seeing people on the move before they come to Canada. So the more those folks in the US understand about the Canadian situation, the better they can inform people on the move. So that information sharing piece across the border is really important. Ever since the additional protocol was signed, we've been monitoring conditions at the border, trying to figure out how many people are still trying to cross, what is happening to those people, what are the alternative arrangements if they can't get into Canada. We're continuing to monitor how the 14-day rule is going to be implemented, because that's going to have huge, huge implications for people's human rights. And there's a lot that's still not clear about the 14-day rule. And as of about 2 weeks ago, we have successfully launched the Canada-US Border Rights Clinic, which is a legal clinic that's going to provide information and legal advice to people relating to the conditions at the Canada-US border, and hopefully will ultimately build up capacity, may sometime in the future be able to provide legal representation and other kinds of legal services, emergency stays of removal, or if people were turned back wrongly, then to appeal those kinds of wrong decisions, that kind of thing. But that's another initiative. Basically, the Border Rights Clinic is an initiative that came from the Canada-US Border Network, because we realized there was a huge need for legal advice, and it's an extremely specialized area, and we weren't able to get it done through pro bono, like using pro bono lawyers alone. We realized we needed kind of lawyers who are dedicated to looking at issues at the Canada-US border. And so the idea of the clinic is in order to fill that gap that we identified.
I have a question.
Yeah, go ahead.
So it's the first time I'm hearing about this being like so far away. I didn't know about this, but why didn't they like build a crossing border, an official crossing border over there? Wouldn't it be like an easier way for them to deal with all those people? Like, if you don't want all those people to cross the border illegally, why don't you reinstate the official crossing border?
It's a good question. If we think back to kind of the rules of the Safe Third Country Agreement, I guess you mean the old rules, or?
Yeah, based on the old rules.
Based on the old rules.
Wasn't it easier
So
to just
what would happen if they reopened the road and put an official port of entry there? Then what would happen? Like, what would happen next?
The rules would apply. I mean,
Yeah.
from the official's point of view, not from the refugees' point of view.
Yeah. So then the rules would apply, and so what would the refugees on the move do?
Return, come, being refused, and then
I think they would do something different.
try to find another way.
Then they would drive and find it.
People are gonna enter regardless. I think with agreements, they're just gonna create some standardization.
So it would be nice to have a map of the whole US-Canada border, but it's like that. It's somewhere between 4,000 and 8,000 kilometers long. It's so big. So if you can't cross at Roxham Road anymore, there's many other roads that look an awful lot like that one. And so the same thing could potentially happen at another road.
I thought it was just an exception, and I thought, like, why wouldn't you just reinstate the official border?
So, okay, so all along, there's this well-documented phenomenon of people crossing at Roxham Road because it's not an official port of entry. But even with people crossing at Roxham Road, there were also crossings happening in other places. Okay. It's just that Roxham Road was the best known one, and it was so well known and so commonly used that there was this like pseudo infrastructure that was put there. But people were also crossing at other points, and people continued to cross at other points.
Do you have any idea of the demographics of the people crossing in? They were racialized and anything else?
So it changed over the course of, I mean, I've been largely working on this issue, I would say, since 2017-ish. And Initially, there was a lot of people who had been settled for a long time in the US who were from countries where there was a lot of violence and couldn't go back to that country. And under Trump, they thought that they would lose status or be deported. So initially, it was a lot of people who were like settled in the US and felt uncertain about their future in the US and were coming. And so I think Haitian was a common nationality because there were a lot of people with temporary protected status from Haiti in the US, and they thought they were going to lose that status. So there were a lot of Haitians coming. So there was a while when there was a number of people from Turkey coming, a lot of Colombians and Venezuelans. There were a lot of people who had crossed through the Darien Gap in Colombia and like up through Central America and up through Mexico and up through the US. So for example, at our border network meetings, we would tend to ask, the service providers who are on the ground, like, who are you seeing there and why? It wasn't surveys, it was more just like, who are we, like literally, who are we seeing or who are we chatting with? And, what are we tending to see?
And so like the influx would be, like, it would be really dependent on US politics. Something that's happening in the US. Would you then see a spike of people coming in?
You know how mobility is, it's dependent on so many things.
Yeah.
So sometimes it was related to US politics, but even as, the situation in Venezuela got a lot worse, then you started to see more people from Venezuela coming. There was a while, as I said, there was a number of people coming from Turkey. And I think in that case, it probably was that a few people came and then they talked to other people who were struggling in Turkey. And then, there's kind of like this word of mouth that it was a way to get to Canada. So it really, there's like ebbs and flows. But I think, from a Canadian perspective that really centers whiteness, like from a Canadian perspective, it was largely racialized people because from the Canadian perspective, most conflicts happen in places with racialized people.
Exactly. And so when you see that adjustment happen in March 2023, was it very under that impression of, the level of racialized people?
I mean, I certainly think racism underlies what happened. I don't think that was necessarily the direct rhetoric. The direct rhetoric was more like, there's a lot of pressure on our housing supply and there's a lot of pressure on our ability and it's just too many refugees. It's too many. I think it was like discomfort around large numbers of refugees. But yes, I mean, the fact that it's largely racialized people is not irrelevant.
Sorry, I'm just asking more like these questions. I wonder, I wonder, like, even if this was just in the rest of Canada, if you're saying that too many refugees are coming in, or if it's just in that concentrated area where they're seeing the actual refugees.
So the premier of Quebec was very outspoken about the pressure that Quebec was facing, and was making a lot of noise and getting a lot of publicity and putting a lot of pressure on the Canadian government. It's very complicated. You'd have to break down so much because they were kind of saying, nobody's helping us with this issue, but the federal government actually was giving them funding, but they were kind of pretending that they were like alone and helpless and oh, poor us. So there was a lot of, I don't know, like kind of
I'm just
exaggerated
how
rhetoric.
The refugees are being used as kind of political tool as well.
I mean, there's a lot of sensitivity in Canada around a housing affordability crisis at the moment. So I think that was a big thing, people feeling like we can't even afford to take care of our own and house our own. And so I think that was a big piece of it. I think that, this kind of fantasy of control over the border is always at play when we talk about these kinds of things. The more people who cross the border, the less you can have this fantasy that, we get to control who enters. I think the support organizations and the nonprofit organizations in Quebec largely were saying, it's pressure, it's more people that we're serving, but we can do it. But the premier really was very outspoken that it was too many people and that they couldn't be expected to, house the whole world.
I wonder like if you can give some of the history background of Latin, even in like an article, or I'm interested in seeing like the deeper seeds of it.
Yeah, it's something maybe I could share later. I think we've been so busy in response mode. So when we started this border network, it was in 2019, and like we were feeling really good about the power of knowledge sharing and connecting these organizations across the border. And we were getting so much good work done. We were very excited. And then the pandemic hit and the regime, I didn't even talk about the pandemic, but there was a whole kind of regime around the border related to the pandemic. So then we were in this kind of like response mode to the pandemic and all the changes in the pandemic. And that was a huge amount of work to kind of monitor the changing conditions at the border and respond to the needs that were being presented when people weren't allowed to cross the border. And then, things were kind of normalizing post-pandemic. And then there was the kind of change to the Safe Third Country Agreement and all of the kind of protests against the change to the Safe Third Country Agreement. So I haven't had a lot of time to actually like look back
at all the evolution of it.
Yeah, but I know from some of the people who work on the ground, some of those organizations, that there is a much longer history of crossing.
I think from the tweet to now is just a huge shift, right?
Yes, it is a huge shift.
It's a huge shift in a very relatively short amount of time. So I'm trying to kind of understand in my own mind, how are we changing Canada's perception of something that's welcoming, even in the work that I do, and how refugees so far away from Canada see Canada as this place of opportunity, and kind of having to, even with themselves, contend with that idea of Canada, and how Canada is now placing and positioning itself to the international stage as no longer as welcoming as there was that assumption of being before. So
yeah, and to be honest, I still hear people talk about Canada's proud tradition of welcoming refugees. Canada does like to talk about itself as a place that is welcoming to refugees. But what Canada wants is to welcome the refugees that they choose.
Very selective, yeah.
They want to choose how many refugees come through the resettlement program, and they want to choose who comes through the resettlement program. Like that's the fantasy, is that only the refugees that we choose will come.
Yeah. I did an interview with someone at the Globalization Center. They were talking about African migrant deaths in Toronto. So people were waiting in long lines to get shelter. They ended up dying in the cold. So they were exactly talking about this, that Canada presents one image. It's very selective. It's very discriminatory on who gets to enter and what services provided to them once they do enter. So, and it was very interesting because we were all talking about like, really, he even said he's like, Canada was thought when I was in Rwanda, they're like this place of milk and honey and everyone would get this. And then when I arrived, I was so overburdened. I was waiting for hours at the shelter. I ended up sleeping. And it's just the reality of what Canada is and what refugees have to go through once they enter is such a stark difference.
Yeah, and part of what happened there is that, with increased numbers of refugees coming to Canada, the different governments started to kind of play chicken with the federal government and say, we don't have to fund it, you have to fund it. No, we don't have to fund it, you have to fund it. And so the real result of that kind of fiscal wrestling is that there were people sleeping outside of that shelter in downtown Toronto in the cold.
And even in like the suburbs, even in like Mississauga and Brampton, like it's become such a massive thing.
Yeah, for sure.
There's a question online from Madison. What was the public discourse leading up to this March 2023 decision? Was there extensive media coverage on the fate of the policy decision in Canada beforehand? Did conversations surrounding refugee migration into Canada increase after the decision?
So there was this increased rhetoric that too many refugees were coming. Like that's definitely the case. There were a lot of people calling for the expansion of the Safe Third Country Agreement. There was a lot of pressure, particularly from the Premier of Quebec, as I said, but also lots of other voices were saying, this is not how it should be. But there was no hint that the change of March 2023 was coming. In fact, refugee lawyers themselves thought that there would have to be an announcement. Usually regulatory changes get announced in this bulletin called the Canadian Gazette. They usually get announced in advance. And so because no one had seen anything published in the Gazette, there was an assumption that there was no change coming. And the other presumption was that the US would not want to expand. We knew that Canadian politicians were under pressure and that they would want to expand the Safe Third Country Agreement, but it had to be an agreement between the US and Canada. And because basically it means more people will get turned back into the United States. And so our presumption was also that the United States would support the status quo and would not want to agree to an expanded safe third country agreement. So, I mean, I can't underscore really enough how shocked we were. Actually, we had gotten a little bit of a rumor, I'm trying to remember, maybe like 6 hours before it was announced. Someone said like there's a chance that something might be announced about Roxham Road because Biden came to visit Trudeau, and at the end of their meeting they did a public kind of, you know, like meet the press, and they made some announcements, and it was announced in this kind of like public like end of summit press conference. Yeah, and we had heard kind of a rumor a few hours before the press conference that something might be announced relating to Roxham Road, but we didn't see it coming at all. So there wasn't a lot of discussion, because people would say, oh, we should close that loophole of that allows people to cross at Roxham Road, and then people would come back and say, yeah, but that's not realistic, it's never going to happen. Like that's kind of what the conversation was like. I think that I missed like the end part of the question.
Did conversations surrounding refugee migration into Canada increase after the decision?
That's a tough thing to say, because actually immigration is so talked about in Canada anyway. You know, there were definitely the advocate voices saying that, you know, this was a poor decision and this was the wrong choice, but I'm not sure like the public at large really understood what all was at stake. It starts to get so technical. I'm not sure there was like a big public backlash. We were doing protests outside Minister Mendocino's office for months and months and months, but I think a lot of people, like they would walk by or drive by and really had no idea what we were protesting and no idea what was going on. So I think the kind of general public understanding was, or attention span, you know how it is in like the media cycle now, I think it was kind of limited. But immigration gets lots and lots of attention in Canada, and it's getting especially attention in Canada now relating to housing affordability, relating to vulnerability of international students. And there is going to be an election in Canada sometime in the next, I don't know, like 14 months, I think. And there's lots and lots of people saying that under Trudeau's government, kind of like the right hand doesn't know what the left hand is doing. Like it's been too fragmented, and they've kind of dropped their eye on the most important parts of the immigration system. So the immigration system is getting lots of attention, but I would say like for the most part, other than the people who are affected by what was happening at the US-Canada border directly, I think it's not really that much part of the conversation.
What would you think would be if you had a hypothesis about why the US had the incentive to proceed with the additional proposal?
Yeah, that was my question
Yeah,
too.
why would they be okay with letting people?
Yeah, I would love to
These
know.
are great questions, and everybody has these questions.
I would love to know.
Canada versus America, you think America would be
Win.
more closed off?
So, okay, wait, then I have to try to remember now. Hang on a second. My suspicion is that initially, when the agreement was passed, it was something that Canada had long wanted, but the US never wanted initially. But in the aftermath of September 11th and this kind of heightened kind of national security state vibe, the US really wanted more cooperation and more information sharing around security issues. And so the suspicion is that Canada made some concessions around information sharing in 2004, or actually 2002 is when it was passed. And so that's how Canada got the initial Safe Third Country Agreement passed. So I ask myself whether there were concessions made to the US this time, but nobody that I know of has been able to find any evidence of what those are.
Right.
But I would also love to know.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Or maybe we're not meant to know.
I think we're not meant to
We're
know.
not meant to know.
I have a more technical question. Maybe everybody knows, but how can you count those 40 days?
That is why we are monitoring the implementation of the 14-day rule. Because what we've been told, so various kind of like refugee rights organizations, and there's an umbrella organization in Canada, the Canadian Council for Refugees, that kind of represents lots of refugee rights organizations. So in conversations between the Canadian Council for Refugees, which is called CCR, and the Canada Border Services Agency, CBSA, they started to talk about what that's going to look like in practice. And they said, so far, what we've heard is that CBSA only really intends to pursue it when it's like very obvious that someone has just crossed. Like if we see you crossing or we catch you crossing, then that's how we know, but that they're not going to do these kind of like rigorous, background checks. But I think if I were a person that wanted to cross, I would probably take a picture of myself with a timestamp or something, like so that I know that I can show when I was there and when I was here, and once I get to the other place, then take another picture. And
Do you think they'll start developing new technologies to track this 14 days?
Oh,
Like an
I'm
app?
sure they will.
Remember the COVID app?
I
They put into that.
So here's
It was
the
so
thing.
bad.
And so the other thing is, I don't think many lawyers have come across cases where there's been contention about the 14-day rule. And so it's going to take time to like actually see it come up in cases to see how it's being implemented. So, and at the moment, what CBSA has been saying is that they're only really going to pursue that kind of aspect of it if it's very obvious that the person only just entered. But if someone makes an inland claim and, in Toronto, and there's no reason to think that they only just crossed a few hours ago, then the claim would be accepted. But the rule stands. Just because it's being interpreted loosely now doesn't mean that it will always be interpreted loosely. And yes, it does create an opportunity to think that if we control it and enforce it more harshly, and if we surveil it better, then we can exclude more refugees. So I think the way that rule is implemented could really change over time.